Good evening. Welcome to the Frontline Club and the first collaboration between the Frontline Club and Monocle 24. My name is Steve Bloomfield. I'm the executive editor of Monocle magazine and also the host of the Foreign Desk, which is the weekly international affairs programme on our radio station Monocle 24. Today's debate is going to be broadcast live on the Frontline Club's website. It will also be edited, and a version will form this weekend's edition of the Foreign Desk on Monocle 24. So if you do not want to be seen, please cower near the back. And if you do not want to be heard, don't ask a question. There will be time for questions. Do wait until, obviously I say it's you who can speak, and also wait until the microphone gets to you so everyone can hear. Also, if you could turn your phones off or to silent, that would be. We have a great panel here for you today. On my left is Patrick Kingsley, on my far left indeed. He's the Guardian's migration correspondent based in Cairo. Here is Quentin Peel, who's an associate fellow at the Institute for International Affairs, better known for as Chatham House, and was previously the Berlin bureau chief, amongst other jobs, for the Financial Times. On my right, Maurice Wren is the chief executive of the Refugee Council, and we also have Catherine Costello, who is an associate professor of international human rights and refugee law at the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford University. So that is your panel. And let me begin with Patrick Kingsley. You've been writing about this issue of migration over a number of months. You've been interviewing people smugglers, migrants, coastguards, diplomats. Tell us a bit about the situation on the ground before people make this journey.
Well, I think the first thing that hits you when you start talking to people on the other side of the Mediterranean is that I don't really understand how military action could work. The process through which the boats leave the North African coast is quite an informal process. It's not like smugglers have a group of boats at their disposal in a particular place that is easily identifiable as a smuggler's fleet. What happens is they would approach a local fisherman and ask them, maybe in the days prior to a smuggling mission, if they could buy their boat. And the going rate for perhaps a 17, 18 metre wooden boat as of a month ago was 150,000 dinar, which is about 75,000 pounds. And then at the point that the money changes hands, that's the point that this fishing boat, which is moored in port, becomes a smuggling boat. So it's a very imperceptible change. And for a foreign navy or a foreign army to itemize when that boat becomes a smuggling boat and then to start to come up with plans to destroy it, I think would be pretty hard. And it would become apparent that it's a smuggling boat is when it goes out to sea on the evening of its mission, and when it moors, and when an hour, 2 hours later, migrants start to be loaded onto it from smaller inflatable boats, by which time it's too late to target it. So if you're hoping to take out the boats that smugglers use, you'd really have to take out a whole port full of fishing boats. Or you're going to have to be very responsible and start to target boats that already have migrants, refugees on them. So I mean, for me, this is the sort of main point that I want to talk about, because the debate that seems to be coming out of Brussels at the moment seems to bear little relation to how people are.
And remind us, the people that you've been talking to who are wanting to make this journey, what are their reasons for wanting to leave in the first place?
Well, there's lots of different reasons, but I think if you look at the numbers, the highest proportions of the biggest proportion are Eritreans, and they're coming from what is probably one of the most severe police states in the world, where you have to join the army and you can never really leave military service for the entirety of your life. And so it's an enormously constrictive environment. And once you leave, if you're an Eritrean, you're never really that safe. In Sudan, the Sudanese often repatriate you back to Eritrea. Sometimes Eritreans say their friends have been seized and taken back by the Eritrean secret police. And there's similar in Egypt, and then in Libya, Eritreans are often kidnapped by smugglers and tortured for ransom. So there's never really a safe space for them, and that's why as of the end of April, the highest proportion of people crossing the sea this year were Eritreans. So I mean, when Theresa May was talking on the Today programme a couple of weeks ago about, I think she mentioned Eritreans, she even might mention Somalians as people that are going for economic reasons. Well, that's just blatantly not true. So I mean, that's another myth I wanted to dispel.
Maurice Wren, talk to us about the numbers. Why have they increased, and is this actually something we're just going to have to get used to?
Numbers in the Med, last year certainly less than 300,000 made the journey. This year they're expecting projections to be much higher. The context, I think, is people are on the move in numbers that we've not seen since the end of the Second World War, and they're moving in search of safety and hope. What's happening in the Mediterranean is certainly a humanitarian crisis, but it's a manifestation, the most local manifestation as far as Europe's concerned, of a global refugee forced migration catastrophe. The crisis in the Med, I like to talk in those terms, but it's not a crisis in Europe. There's a political challenge in Europe, but the numbers are manageable if there was the political will to do so and political leadership to ensure that Europe was geared up for the responsibility it needs to take. I think the focus on disrupting smugglers willfully ignores the reasons why people are getting on board the boats in the first place, and simply destroying the boats isn't going to change that, why people are still going to make hazardous journeys through other routes. And the reason why they will, is there are no legal routes to get into Europe for the purpose of claiming political asylum and refugee status. Fortress Europe has worked pretty effectively over the last decade or so through external border controls or visa restrictions or carriers' liability legislation. We applaud the European Commission. I would applaud our UK government for some of the things they've been saying about we've got to deal with the drivers of forced migration. Yes, of course we have. But that doesn't mean, and that can't be an excuse for doing nothing about ensuring the safety of people who are setting out on those hazardous journeys. And we can do things, there's plenty we can do in the UK and as part of a European response, opening up resettlement routes, relaxing family reunification criteria, getting into the issuing of humanitarian visas through foreign embassies. There's a whole raft of tools that can be used if there was the political will.
You mentioned the lack of legal routes. Some European politicians would say, well, there aren't legal routes because there shouldn't be legal routes. We can't cope with these people coming here.
Well, as I've said earlier on, I think that's misleading. I think we can cope with the numbers if it's allied, if it's part of a package of measures that also starts to tackle the drivers. But we can't say the only action we can take is people leaving their home countries in the first place and invest in those countries and work with those governments, because people are going to leave and they're on the move. And do we sit back and wait for the next tragedy to occur in the Mediterranean? I fear yes. That's what will move the political discussion in the UK on a further notch. I was talking to somebody in the Home Office, senior figure in the Home Office yesterday, who describes the discussions happening at the senior level around the minister as fantasy land, because it's completely devoid of any context, global context for what the UK does, and that's not a sustainable position.
Catherine Costello, let's look at what Europe's doing. There was some form of search and rescue operation, then it was downgraded and it wasn't really a search and rescue operation at all. Then there was the most high-profile tragedy earlier this year, and they talked about maybe having a search and rescue operation again. What was happening now?
Well, we originally saw Italy taking on a very extensive search and rescue role in the Mediterranean. I think it would be fair to say of unprecedented scale, which was partly in response to the fact that there's no effective government in Libya. But I think very nobly, the migrants that were being rescued at sea were being brought to Italy. Not that long ago, the Italian government was cooperating with the Libyan government and returning migrants and refugees to Libya in defiance of international law in the era when Berlusconi was cooperating with Gaddafi. So, even if we try to contextualize this narrative by 5 or 10 years, you see a very different story. That I think Italian operation was always one which was inviting Europe to put their flag on the Mare Nostrum operation. I think at one stage the Italian relevant minister tweeted that, we're waiting for the European flag to be put on this operation. And what the EU did was a much scaled down operation called Triton, which didn't have an active search and rescue role and also patrolled a tiny area in comparison with Mare Nostrum, which went all the way into Libyan waters and far beyond the Italian search and rescue area. So it was entirely predictable with this much scaled down search and rescue operation and the drivers, and that spring came. Everybody knew that more people were going to get on boats. As Maura said, what has changed is really the scale of the crises that is driving movement at the moment, but that's always going to ebb and flow. Around 400,000 people claim asylum in Europe in a normal year, let's say. So it's gone up from that. But that 400,000 has really gone up and down if you track it over 20 years. And in fact, as the EU has expanded, the number of asylum seekers it is accommodating has not expanded. So actually there's less of a burden. And we have well-developed asylum systems. So I agree, there isn't a crisis in Europe. There's a challenge with increasing numbers. And I just endorse what Maura said about the lack of safe means of access. One of the things that really troubles me at the moment, as well as the move to deal with this through military means, which I think, as Patrick said, is just terrifying when you really think what that might mean on the ground, is the importation of some illegal practices from Australia. And Australia has been able to suppress, or at least claims that it has been able to suppress irregular movement by boat, but the geography is so different. Any day I can cross the Mediterranean in a ferry. Every time I speak about this, I usually Google how much a ticket on a ferry from Tunisia to Italy is going to cost on that day. It's usually less than £50. So this is a sea which is perfectly navigable and which always was a sea where there was a lot of mobility. Some of my colleagues in Oxford who work on mobility from Morocco to Spain talk about the era when there was free movement, again, which isn't that long ago. 20 years ago, there would have been relatively free movement from Morocco to Spain. And I suppose the idea that we're going to try to suppress movement in the Mediterranean, given the geography, just seems so absurd to me. And when I ask colleagues who work on refugee issues in Italy, 20 years ago, people made irregular journeys to Italy. The difference is they didn't die doing them. So what has made the journey more deadly? And I think what's made it more deadly is the suppression of even irregular movement. So Tunisian fishermen who used to offer safe passage, fortunately, now don't do that anymore because the Italian government might seize your boat. And there have been a number of high-profile examples of seizures of fishing vessels. In fact, an NGO, famously Cap Anamur, was prosecuted in Italy for assisting irregular migration. They were ultimately acquitted, but not after they lost their boat and a huge amount of financial resources in fighting the case. So we've done a huge amount to suppress legal movement and also to suppress irregular movement. The journey is deadly. That's new. The instability in Italy has contributed to that. But we Europeans, and Britain too, sitting conveniently behind a raft of EU member states, have made a lot of very deliberate policy choices which have made this journey deadly. And I think there's responsibility in that context that we don't often talk about.
Quentin Peel, why have European political leaders been so reluctant to do more, do you think?
Because they're terrified of their voters. And they're terrified of a very large section of the media, certainly in this country, which panders to the prejudices of their voters. But there is a very real issue, and we'd be wrong to deny that there is an issue there. I think that there are a lot of people who are anxious about immigration. And the trouble is that, and I think, and I would be very happy if tonight we can explore the issue of how the media covers this question. The trouble is that the media has allowed, you know, the words asylum seeker to be demonized when they should be, you know, a profoundly moral concept. This suddenly becomes sort of that word illegal immigrants. The you know, use of words like hordes coming. Now, I wanted to actually say to Catherine, I suspect it's two things. It's not just trying to clamp down on the illegal trade. There's been an increase. We're seeing some very substantial flows that we didn't see before, like Syria. Now, what caused Syria? Yes, we have a handle in it. What Iraq and Afghanistan were the big sources before of migrants, and hey, we had a role in that. So there's always two sides to the story, but the flows have increased, the political panic has increased, and countries have dealt with it very differently. If you look in Europe, Sweden has probably been dramatically the most generous. A long way.
It's taken 100,000 Syrian refugees. There are more Iraqi refugees in Malmo than in Britain.
Indeed. And what's happened? Yes, an anti-immigration party has arrived in the Swedish parliament, has in fact prevented having a stable government emerging in Sweden. 13% of the vote, particularly strong in Malmo. So it's very difficult. Germany has, very interestingly, transformed from being, if you like, an anti-immigration country. The first time I worked there as a journalist in the early 90s, when the motto of German politicians was, Deutschland ist kein Einwanderungsland. Germany is not a country of immigration. Today, Germany actually accepts that it is a country of immigration, which is a dramatic change. On the other hand, Britain, Ireland, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, all countries where we've had a backlash against immigration, and we've had a political establishment in these countries who have actually scared. And that's been quite, you know, so it's a very difficult problem to deal with. It's a very real problem, but it's a problem that I would go along with the two previous speakers. It can be dealt with. It's not a crisis. It's a crisis for the poor bloody people who are coming.
Maurice, this isn't the first time there have been lots of people trying to come to Europe. Have there been examples in the past where you believe European leaders have actually dealt with this in a far more humane way?
I guess the most would be the crisis in Bosnia, the war in former Yugoslavia, when the UK government of the time pledged to take 40,000 refugees from Bosnia. We didn't in the end. We took just over 20 and provided, and it was on a particular scheme which was a temporary admission programme, and the assumption was that most would return, and I think high numbers have returned. So we've looked into this before, and you go back further to the Vietnamese
but what's
programme.
changed?
What's changed, I think, is the world has changed, and we've got a smaller place. It's easier for people to make their own way. I think Quentin's right. We've got a rise of nationalism throughout Europe, throughout the world. It's making it very difficult to make a humanitarian case for opening our doors to protection to more people. That's certainly changed. But I was reflecting with colleagues this morning about, in anticipation of tonight, just some of the reading I'd been doing last week about the response to some of the boats that set out from mainland Europe full of Jews in the 30s looking for refuge. They were turned away by governments of every stripe around the world. What eventually led to was the Geneva Convention to protect refugees. But my goodness, through 5-6 years of the most brutal, shameful war, let's pray that we don't have to repeat that example to discover. I was
horrified in the last few days to be told by regarded as an entirely sensible member of the British political class, that we ought to be revisiting that UN convention, because that was done for white Europeans.
Patrick, a lot of people have said in the media, look, if we have, and there was the famous quote that, from the British Minister in the Lords about the search and rescue operation, that if we had a search and rescue operation, it would act as a pull factor, that if people knew they were going to be saved, they'd come in greater numbers, so to paraphrase, let them drown. When you have talked to people who are going to make this journey, how aware are they of not just the risks of making it, but also the fact that when they reach Europe, if and when they reach Europe, there is still a very, very long way to go?
Well, I think it's abundantly clear that it wasn't a pull factor. We've had more people coming this year than came at this point last year, and last year was a record year. And if anyone in Europe had actually bothered to go and talk to people who are refugees on the other side of the Mediterranean, they would have realised that within 3 or 4 conversations, because conversation after conversation you have with refugees in Egypt, in Libya, they say, yes, we know the risks. One guy was saying to me, we all share the articles on the internet about like the latest crash, or latest shipwreck rather. But and he quoted a French saying to me, which I probably get wrong, but the gist of it was, a dead goat doesn't fear the butcher's knife, i.e. we're already in the most hellish situations on this side of the Mediterranean. Why would we worry about getting on a leaking wooden vessel being crammed in the hold for 3 days if we're already pretty much dead? And psychologically, if not physically. And another Syrian in Egypt told me, even this is before we were talking about military action. This is a couple of months ago. He was saying, even if they decided to bomb the boats, people would still keep coming. And that was before we entered this debate. So I mean, it's, as has been mentioned by Morris and others, this is the biggest wave of mass migration since the end of the Second World War. The idea that ending Mare Nostrum or bombing boats or military action against smugglers is going to stop something that starts far beyond the edge of the Mediterranean, that goes thousands of miles through the deserts to West Africa or to the Horn of Africa or through the Middle East. I mean, it's just fanciful.
Catherine, when people make this journey and when they do finally reach Europe, talk to us a bit about how they are welcomed, if I can use that phrase, when they actually arrive in Greece or in Italy.
Yeah. Well, I guess if we think about arriving in either of those 2 countries, I think it's fair to say, and this is borne out in the figures, that most people who arrive don't want to make their asylum claim there. But there's an EU system called Dublin, which allocates responsibility for processing asylum claims. And in effect, what that means at the moment is that if anybody wants to move onwards because their family's in Sweden, or they simply think life will be better for them somewhere else in the EU, they chances and ask Italy to transfer them to one of those other countries, but that's very unlikely to work. And so most of those people continue their irregular journey. There's a wonderful documentary called Europe's Immigration Catastrophe, which follows the journey of an Eritrean woman who arrives in Italy, ends up in detention. There are various other twists, but then she eventually does get to Sweden, but all the way being smuggled, spending her money, vulnerable again to exploitation on the journey to Northern Europe, and then claims asylum in Sweden. So this is the crazy system we have at the moment, and it's in that context. And then Sweden could legally send her back to Italy or to Greece, unless, and there's a very high threshold for resisting that return back to the first country, which legally you could only resist that return back if you demonstrate that the conditions there were inhuman and degrading, which is a really difficult standard to meet. So you can get tied up in these kinds of proceedings, which are all a prelude to examining the asylum claim. So there's a whole stage of legal machinations which take tons of time and money, which are just about deciding which state is going to examine the claim. And in that context, what the Commission proposed yesterday, building on statements earlier, which was relocating people from Italy and Greece in particular on an emergency basis, is a real breakthrough. Because at the moment, governments like the UK are happily participate in this thing called the Dublin system, because it would allow them to deport people back to Italy, Greece, Germany, wherever it is. It looks natural then, and as a Home Office official once told me in an unguarded moment, those are easy removals. They count as deportations. This is the state doing something natural to assert its kind of natural sovereignty over the movement of people. And the relocation would at least allow a mechanism to be in place where people could leave Italy or Greece in some sort of orderly way and not have to do that irregularly.
Quentin, we were talking before about the rise of anti-immigration parties in places like Sweden, which has had a lot of immigrants arriving. Do you think part of that is down to the fact that European governments have been pretty poor at integration over the last 20 or 30 years?
Yes, I think that a great deal more could have been done. That you see it in the language as well as the thinking process. Remember that Labour Party mug during the election campaign? We control immigration. No. What we should be thinking about is we are actually planning the integration process. And I think that has constantly been a very secondary factor. It's a two-way factor, though. It's not just teaching immigrants English. It's actually also preparing receiving communities to take in people. And it's not an easy process, Look at the places that were voting UKIP in the elections. These are actually places with very few immigrants, but a very left behind and rather defensive English population that feels threatened by the thought of it. So I'm absolutely sure the integration process is important. Even when, and it sometimes sounds quite offensive to listen to if you like, the integration debate, which is they must learn English or they must learn German or, And yes, that is actually, because that opens up a huge world to them. And you do have problems in some of the immigrant communities where women may be denied access to education and therefore end up not speaking the language as well as they might, and so it is more difficult for them. So it's a very difficult two-way process, integration, but we should be planning. I've forgotten, sorry, Maurice, was it you who said it, that we actually have an idea of the numbers ahead. We need to plan for those sort of numbers, or maybe it was you, Patrick. We know that the reality of today's world is a world of migration. It's a world both of migration from conflict, but also migration from poverty. It's a reality we can't stop.
I'll tell you another reality about the UK is that we do refugee resettlement extremely well. And I know that because we're refugee councils involved in it in Sheffield and Hull and a couple of other places. The numbers are pitiful, less than 750 on what's called a gateway resettlement programme, people brought from refugee camps, can be around the world through the offices of
in the whole country.
750 a year in the UK.
Gosh, that's
and then a couple of other smaller schemes for Syrians. But we do it well because it's planned, it's well resourced, the work is done on the ground in communities to prepare, and we've got Sheffield, believe it or not, is regarded through Western Europe as the poster city for resettlement because we do it so well. We've been doing it now for 11 years and it's a credit, but we don't do enough of it.
But surely this is part of the problem for frankly, the people up here on stage, because in this room, everyone may well nod along and say, yes, we should do more, and it's outrageous that we're not doing more. But outside this room, and in places like Clacton, places, in Malmo, for example, lots of people are going to say, no, I don't think we should. And that debate, you're on the losing side at the moment.
Maybe in the UK, but not everywhere. I mean, German public opinion has remained and is currently very strongly in favour of expanding which is on the ground, local communities welcoming refugees, new shelters being built all over Germany, similarly in Sweden. I know it's vulnerable and there will be a backlash inevitably at a certain moment. But I think, especially in Germany, there was, as I read it, in a response to the Pegida movement, quite a lot of, sort of mainstream opinion, really acting out through volunteering and actually actively welcoming refugees in their communities. And I think what has really maybe made the difference is that it's not really possible at the moment to say asylum seeker equals bogus when there is an awareness of the Syrian crisis and awareness of situations in states like Eritrea. It doesn't apply for all asylum seekers because not all asylum seekers are refugees in the legal sense, and we shouldn't forget about people who aren't refugees in the legal sense but might still have very good reason for moving. And as Maurice said, resettlement is the appropriate response. If you have people who are out of immediate danger, if you think about Syrians in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Egypt, if you are in a country of first asylum, as we call it, that's okay, you're out of immediate danger. And then as the years wear on, your savings are gone, you're dependent on aid, your children have no future. And that becomes intolerable. And there's a moment when people start to leave irregularly. And that's partly what we're seeing with the Syrian. So there's a very stark choice. We can let people move irregularly, deplete all of their savings, and arrive physically, emotionally, financially depleted, or there could be a global, organized resettlement program for Syrians and those who have fled Syria. It's happened before with the Indo-Chinese crisis. It's in everybody's self-interest. It's in anybody who cares about stability in the Middle East. And one of the big things from the point of view of refugees who are waiting it out in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Egypt, is that it gives people an ability to plan. If you have credible resettlement pledges, people won't make that irregular journey. They won't sit at home saying, well, will we sell everything now and get to Turkey and get smuggled and spend years trying to do that too. It's not a straightforward one hop on a boat. You have to really invest a huge amount of emotional energy and financial energy doing that. So instead of that, there's a choice. And I think, those stories can be explained. The fact that Syrians are refugees, they're already out of immediate danger, but they have no future there. Some of them may feel that they want to stay closer to home. Not everybody wants to move. Not everybody wants to be resettled. But at least to dampen down the demand for irregular movement. We have a way of doing it. It's called resettlement. It works really well.
And take pressure off the governments in the refugee first receivers.
I just want to bring in Patrick here, because I want to go back to some of these root causes that we've touched on before with Eritrea. You time in Libya. This is a country that the UK, France, the US, with NATO, we liberated. We got rid of Gaddafi. This was all supposed to be a lot better. There's an argument, isn't there, that if Gaddafi had stayed where he was, there wouldn't be quite so many people coming right now.
There is the argument. I haven't. When I go to Libya, it's to focus on migration. So my sense of the longer-term historical issues are probably not as worth listening to. But certainly, after the Western intervention, the European intervention, there was not enough emphasis placed on creating a stable government there. And we see the fruits of that now, where you have two rival governments, neither of whom has any interest in stopping this huge wave of migration. They have thousands and thousands and thousands of people from the Middle East, West. That's not their priority. Their priority is to fight a war and to win it. And a lot of people, even in government, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they're making money from the flow of people across Libya and onwards from the coast. So you have a situation which has been caused by the war, certainly, and you won't end this flow. You won't end Libya as a launching pad for people crossing the Mediterranean until you have a stable government that is able to invest more in Coast Guard services, and able to invest more in law enforcement. It's very unclear when you go there just exactly who is the army, who are the police forces. They have a separate immigration. Who does that answer to? Even very basic things like that. If European governments wanted to engage properly with them, it would be very hard to. The coast guards that operate all along the western Libyan coast have 3 boats at their disposal. Even if they weren't taking backhanders from the smugglers to allow the fishing boats to leave the ports, they wouldn't be able to stop migrants leaving, and they wouldn't be able to rescue them, and they aren't able to rescue them. So again, it leads about the futility of trying to launch military action. Really, there are so many other things you could do before you started to do that, and one would be an emphasis on the UN peace talks, which really isn't part of the European debate at the moment about how to respond to the crisis. You need a stable Libya first before you can even end that as a launching pad. And then the bigger thing is that once you put a stopper in that well of migrants, if you like, there will be other places that people will use as launching pads. I mean, look at Greece. Greece, at the moment, at this point in the year, has had almost as many migrant arrivals by boat as it did in the whole of last year. And what does that tell you? It means that maybe people are being a bit put off by the situation in Libya. They don't want to go there quite as much, but they're finding another way to go. So, I mean, you can fight all you like the smugglers in Libya, for example, but they'll find other routes.
And Quentin, on the issue of Libya, the West seems to have lost interest in Libya now, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think the disaster was that we went in without thinking it through at all. I mean, there's no question but that Gaddafi was a very unpleasant, erratic dictator. He was also like a cork holding back a huge flow of migration that was coming from further down in Africa. What we never did, and that was perfectly obvious to anybody who'd looked at Libya and could see the camps in southern Libya, that actually he, with his vicious regime, was not allowing to come through. What we said was, yeah, we'll just bomb them from the sky because, of course, we don't want to put any of our lads' lives at risk. And we'll get rid of Gaddafi and then all will be peace and light. I mean, a disastrous failure to think through the consequences. Having said which, we then did the opposite in Syria and said, we shall not intervene. And in a way, we've got an even worse situation. It's a failure, I think, at every stage to think through the consequences of our actions. And then I think a failure to take responsibility for the consequences of our actions, because it is perfectly clear that this flood across the Mediterranean does have a direct linkage to the actions that we took, and therefore we must take responsibility. Hey, British government, we shall not be part of this European sharing of the burden or anything else. We will send one naval ship down there to try and either stop them or may pick up a few, land them in Italy, as if we can wash our hands of the whole thing when we were very directly involved. That actually, to me, is almost the worst hypocrisy of all.
We've talked about Libya and Syria. Morris, has also been mentioned that many refugees are coming from Eritrea. Now, I know political reform in Eritrea is not the sexiest of topics, but why do you think, if people actually really want to get to the root causes of what's happening here, that isn't on the agenda?
Well, to an extent, trying to come to an accommodation with the Eritrean government is very much on the UK's agenda, because they see it as a way of stopping the flow of Eritreans into Europe, and some of whom, minority of whom, seek to come to the UK. And to that extent, we've sent senior officials over to meet with the Eritrean government to try and explore what scope there is for coming to some agreement.
But that's for us to help them to keep their people in their country, not to try and make the country
That's for
better
us
for them
to
live in.
attempt to get the kind of guarantees that the UK government think would stand up in court when they were challenged about returning people to Eritrea. There's no question the Eritrean government are saying, yeah, send them back, we'll happily have them back. And the UK would love to send them back. The courts wouldn't let them wear it at the moment, and the UK government's efforts are not being expended on trying to encourage political reform in Eritrea. They're trying to come to dirty deals and memoranda of understanding that enable them to go into court and try and say that people will, but they'll have their rights protected if returned. We're completely going down the wrong road on all this, and clearly Eritrea is one problem, so it needs to be a broader question. Just one thing, if I may, Steve. You said we're on the losing side of this. 2 years ago, Refugee Council was very active in starting up a national campaign to get the UK government to set up a resettlement programme for Syrian refugees. And the attitude of the Home Office was resolute, absolutely not. We're putting aid into the region, that's sufficient, we don't need to do any more. They held that line. They could possibly get away with it. But we built a campaign with lots of other partners and aid agencies and politicians and blah, 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 cross-party campaign that they finally had to relent. What we got was a tiny scheme.
How many now?
500 over 3 years is projected. 187 arrived at the last.
187 Syrian
so
refugees.
far, brought out under a
success,
resettlement scheme. Getting the principle demonstrated that public support, properly directed through parliamentary representatives, gets number 10 thinking about these things in a way the Home Office never will. We just need to get cleverer about how we target support, and then we need to generate public support for a change in policy. And that's down to everybody in the room, not just agencies like us, which in some ways can be seen to as part of the problem.
Maurice mentioned everyone in the room. We'll take some questions and comments and then come back to the panel. Put your hands up high in the air if you... Oh, excellent, good. I was expecting it to be one of those, everyone a bit cautious for the first one. Great, we'll start here at the front. If you could wait for the microphone, say your name and then say your question, that'd be great.
My name is Jenny Kingsley. I'm wondering if members of the panel think that what fuels our distaste for the migrants is this rather simplistic view that if you're a migrant, you're uneducated, you're stupid, you have nothing to give. But many of the people coming to us do want to work, do have skills, do have an education, and they very much want to give to the new world. If only we could embrace that.
We'll take 2 more questions as well in groups of 3, and we'll stick with the front row. So just there and then there, and I'll come to you later. Move further back.
I'm Davina. You mentioned that in Germany there's been a bit of a change in public opinion, and that migration is now viewed positively. What lessons do you think could be taken from that when looking at the case of the UK and how negative migration is currently viewed?
I'm Hadani Ditmars. I wrote a book on Iraq called Dancing in the No-Fly Zone. My question is also about the disconnect psychologically around refugee and immigrant issues, especially in countries that have a history of being settled by immigrants. I'm a Canadian, and we have 2 infamous incidents of sending boat people back. One was the Komagata-Maru, a boatload of Sikhs. The other was Jewish refugees. I'm also the product of English boat people, I guess, because some great-grandparents came over on the steamer from Liverpool, and others were sort of economic migrants from the Midlands, funnily enough. You said Sheffield. That's the Midlands, right? No, not quite. Sorry. I'm Canadian. And there may be a boatload of Canadian journalists coming over soon because our dollar's diving and our papers are dying, but that's another issue. So how do you actually engage the public to reframe the idea of what constitutes a refugee or an immigrant? Remind people about the Geneva Convention.
Okay, let's start with the issue about Germany and lessons there. Quentin Peel, you were the Berlin bureau chief for the Financial Times for many years.
4 years.
4 years.
But I was
you were
previously in
as
Bonn
well.
for nearly the same amount of time.
What has Germany done differently? Why is there a different sense there of this issue?
I think it's very interesting because if you go back to the early 90s, when essentially the refugee situation was the Balkan refugees fleeing Bosnia and so on, and also refugees from the former Soviet Union. And there was a big wave, Germany far bigger than anybody else, and there was quite a backlash. We saw political backlash in Germany, as I said earlier, this phrase, Germany is not a country of immigrants. They would say, France, they had an empire, Britain, they had an empire, therefore they have to accept immigrants. We don't. Now, it's fascinating how that has changed. Why? I think, one, let's be clear, there's a backlash against immigration now is we've got a financial crisis. We've got a financial crisis, we've got an unemployment crisis. Germany, actually, the economy is doing quite well, and there is a labour shortage. So psychologically, there is a greater willingness to accept people coming from outside to work. In this country, and actually it answers your question a little bit about why do people feel threatened by refugees and so on, it is, I think, quite significantly precisely the fact that refugees are willing to work and in quite difficult conditions, because that undercuts the wages of people in this country. I have a son who's a carpenter, and he feels in that sector, oh my God, my wages are being either held down or I'm not getting jobs because there are immigrants who are doing the work. So in Germany, that situation is slightly different. But I think there is two other very important factors. One is the historical factor, the deep realization that it was the nightmare of Nazi rule, the 30s and everything else, which is still very strong in Germany. So even when there was a backlash against immigration in the early 90s, there was a counter push that we cannot behave like this. Was it a mistake, was it not a mistake, in the early 90s was that Wolfgang Schäuble, now the finance minister, then the interior minister, very deliberately distributed asylum seekers around the country to villages that had never seen a black or brown face before, and so on. That actually, done with the best of intentions, caused quite a lot of friction. And therefore, that integration process needs to be thought through very carefully. But finally, I'd come to this point. I mean, we've seen this Pegida movement in Germany, starting in Dresden, a town in former East Germany where there are relatively very few refugees or immigrants or anybody. However, an anti-Muslim movement, again, from a community that itself feels rather left behind by the wealth of West Germany. But secondly, Angela Merkel came out very clearly in her New Year message, and again at other times said, I do not like it, we do not like this sort of movement. Mm-hmm. It is not acceptable, it's not within the German tradition. I mean, if we had even begun to hear that sort of statement from the leaders, political leaders in this country, who would actually say, we do accept people, we must embrace people, we are a country of immigration, and we are a country that believes in refugees, and I don't think we've heard it.
Catherine, how do you try to engage with this issue of dealing with some people's dislike for migrants when the liberal arguments fail?
I mean, I suppose as a lawyer, I think people have all sorts of biases, some of which are reasonable and some are not. We're all entitled to our personal preferences, but we create institutions to foster our better natures and so that we can facilitate cooperation. And the Refugee Convention is one of those institutions. I mean, I think there was sort of a theme in the questions maybe, which was combating stereotypes. And in some ways, I do look to journalists and creative artists. There are amazing films that have been made about the Mediterranean crossing. There's beautiful artwork about the lived experience of Syrian refugees in Lebanon that those stories need to be told. They need to be told by refugees and migrants themselves, and we can combat stereotypes in that way. When I think it comes to categories and institutions, we have to check that they're fit for purpose. And I think one good thing that's come out of the Syrian crisis in legal terms is that there used to be a tendency to think that people fleeing war were not refugees. They were just people fleeing conflict, and a lot of the time we said you're not legally. And the Syrian crisis somehow has changed that. There's been a legal process, and the Bosnian crisis meant we offered people temporary protection. So there at least is an acknowledgement that people in conflict need refuge. It's mainly been in the region, but when they arrive in Europe, they aren't told, oh no, you're not a refugee, that's just a war, which is something we've said to people fleeing other conflict zones. So we've done something useful there with the refugee definition. In the German context, I think what's also interesting historically is that, of course, they were German refugees from East Germany very recently. And you can't talk about a smuggler in Germany without somebody saying, yes, you had to get smuggled out of East Germany, just like you out of Eritrea. So the label can't be appropriated in this crazy suppression of mobility discourse.
Morris.
Just thinking about the general election campaign, every political party, almost without exclusion, supported the principle of the UK providing protection to what they call genuine refugees. UKIP, another caveat, it was genuine refugees. But genuine refugees, and we have a mechanism in this country, as you've suggested, that is fit for purpose in many ways. We spend a lot of money on refugee protection in the UK. We could do it an awful lot better. So the question is, with that level of political principle, why do we fail? Why do we struggle so much with this? Why does the Home Office think it's legitimate to send vans around parts of London with high immigration quotients with signs saying "go home," illegal, go home? Why are the new immigration bill further going down the road of criminalising people who don't have the papers and the status to be in this country? They're not criminals, they may have overstayed a visa, but to start to depict them as criminals is appalling. The poisoning of discussions about migration by concerns about terrorism agenda, quite willful, quite calculated, to further alienate the UK host population from dealing in a mature way with refugees. And of course, in a time of austerity, it's human nature to start to look for simple, or be susceptible to simple lies and look for scapegoating. And if we're going to counter that, it does require strong leadership of the Merkel brand, but not just strong leadership. Two things. One is, you will have seen, I suspect, during the election campaign, the "I am a migrant" posters all over the public transport. Crowd-funded campaign, brought in an awful lot of people, had an amazing impact, the feedback that the agency that led on that had. And the other thing to say is that we're spending less of our time, NGOs that work in this area, engaging with central government and looking much more to cities around the country. Cities have the lived experience and know what wealth comes from, in terms of community cohesion, but also economic wealth comes from welcoming migrants. They also know some of the problems, and they're better placed to deal with them on a practical level. There is a wonderful growing movement in the UK called Cities of Sanctuary. If you don't know about it and you want to get involved, go and have a look at the website. But 40 groups around the country working with their local government to get resolutions passed by the council that we will not allow the destitution of migrants in our, and people saying, we want to be a city of welcome. We want a diverse community in our city, and we want a change in national policy. And no change in political policy, in government policy, without public support. We've got to generate public support.
I'm going to take 3 more questions and then bring Patrick in. There was one here, and then you there. Again, if you can wait for the microphone. And then this gentleman in the far corner here, waving frantically. Let's start here.
Hi, my name's Angela Devan. I'm a freelance reporter. I'm actually from Australia, and it's been interesting to see the Australian influence creeping in. Talk of military action, destroying boats, offshore processing. I'm wondering if anyone on the panel knows of any actual direct ties between Australian officials and European nations. Are they actually talking to each other, or is it a matter of they're just watching and copying? And secondly, and more importantly, lessons learned from Australia's hardline policy. I'm particularly interested in the conditions of detention camps and what might offshore processing look like in this region. Thanks.
There was a gentleman just back there.
This question is slightly directed at Catherine, and she talks about sort of implementing a policy to take immigrants into, Europe and into the UK and save them the pain of, mental and physical and also financial into the UK. I mean, how would you actually implement that? Even if we open the door to 100,000, you're still, leaving 4 out of 5 people behind. How can you possibly get, pick, especially with the financial policy as well? Yeah.
Great. And then this gentleman here.
Hi, yeah. With the human trafficking element, I haven't heard anybody mention about what some of these people are actually trafficked for. So we have like the sex industry, which is a huge industry, and the supply and demand aspect of that, and that also plays into the human trafficking element as well. So it's not just refugees fleeing war. So I would like to know some thoughts on how we can also try and affect people's behaviors, which also play a part in bringing people into the country.
Okay. Patrick, any of those you want to go on?
Yeah, I'd try and respond to all of them. Maybe I got the name wrong. I don't know if there's any connection between Australia and other panelists can talk on that, but on the specific idea of offshore camps, I mean, that has been moved to this idea that instead of refugees having to go to Europe to put in their asylum claim, that they might go to a camp set up by the EU in Niger or in Libya, and that would somehow satisfy their demand to cross the sea, and it would somehow dampen the desire to get in a boat. I just logistically, I don't see how that's possible. You would have thousands of people in these camps. Who exactly is going to staff these camps? The EU doesn't have the people on the ground to do that, so that means you have to suddenly get the host country to put the resources and funding into doing that. And what, are you really going to ask the Egyptian government or the Libyan government or people in Niger with their great human rights record to do that? I hope not. And realistically, it's not an option. And even just on a second practical level, if people are you're still asking migrants in these countries to wait in the same way that they have to wait now. You're still saying, here is an intractable process you don't understand, through which you must now navigate in order to get asylum to go to Europe. I don't see how that would be a better option for them, how that would persuade them that yes, finally we've got a system that we understand that's going to persuade us not to cross the sea. So for all those reasons, I don't really see how offshore camps would work in practice or work as a deterrent to people crossing the sea. I think there was a question about quotas. Would it be enough? You'd still have four out of 5 people. Did I understand that right?
No, it's about how you actually implement it.
Well, I'll bring Catherine in on that.
Okay.
But if you've got anything you want to add on the human trafficking issue.
Yeah, I mean, just obviously, yeah. I mean, I think the kernel of your point perhaps was that we have to think about how we in Europe are to blame for some of the reasons why people are moving, perhaps, right?
Not so much blame, but we're also a part of it in other ways. Not just. So I mean, we mentioned that Germany has a very good economy, but they also have a very big, prostitution trade as well. I mean, we can't forget that as well. So it's a lot of behaviours and almost a demoralisation of different types of people who are good for certain types of people as well.
Maurice, can I bring you in actually on the human trafficking angle?
What we're talking about the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, Central Mediterranean is not trafficking, it's smuggling. It's bringing people in just to either let them loose at sea or bring them to the shores of it. Not smuggling, trafficking is an industry that's about exploitation of commodities in the host country, and you keep control of those commodities and you move them around whilst they make. I can see why we mix up the two, and unfortunately government often mix, but they need to be kept separate if we're going to tackle them, because each requires a different approach. But your general thrust of our culpability picks up, I think, what remarks Quentin was making earlier on. You can be forgiven for thinking around the crisis in the Middle East that we're somehow innocent victims caught in this. Our hands are covered in blood and culpability. We're exploiters on a grand scale around the world. We always have been, and we've got to take responsibility. I wish we weren't, but I don't see it feasible into public policy terms that's going to change. But what can change, understanding that there is responsibility attaches to that.
It's quite striking, isn't it, that the countries at this moment who are most welcoming to people, countries that didn't have empires, and the countries that are actually most hostile at the moment are countries that did.
I want to pick up the issue of the possible solution that was talked about. Catherine, how would this work? I mean, how on earth could we have a situation where you could have, centres, say, in Libya, where people could come and say, hello, I've made this journey away from Eritrea, I'd like to come and live in Europe now?
Well, I think centres in North Africa are a bad idea for the reasons Patrick outlined, but what I was alluding to was resettlement, and we have historical precedents of mass resettlement. The Indo-Chinese crisis is the one most often cited, but resettlement, as Morris said, happens anyway. So there is a practice where UNHCR or other agencies offer resettlement opportunities to refugees in camps. And then when they move to countries of resettlement, they get a lot of social support on the integration side. And it wouldn't be the UK doing it. This needs global or regional cooperation where you get credible pledges about resettlement. Resettlement isn't the solution to irregular movement. Okay, it's a particular response to particular types of refugee crises where you have people living in camps with little future in a way that is going to potentially destabilize the region, and all of those things are currently present in the region of Syria. So this is a particular appropriate response in this situation. And it's already done. It happens on a smaller scale. Agencies know how to screen people for resettlement. This isn't reinventing the wheel. It's just triggering a mechanism that we should have been doing. We should have started doing it in much. So the suggestion of François Crépeau, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants, was to get a firm European commitment, so amongst 27 countries, to resettle 1 million Syrian refugees over 5 years. In 5 years' time, the war there may have ended. Most Syrians probably don't want to leave the region. An awful lot were going back and forth and didn't even want to register with UNHCR for a long time because, Lebanon and Syria have opened. People were just living their lives between two places, avoiding the bombs. And the longer you stay away from home, the more unviable that becomes. So resettlement isn't new. There are already agencies expert in it all around the world. There are civil society organizations that help resettle refugees.
Just on that point, and I just want to bring Quentin on this. We can all sit around here and say, well, this is how it could work, but is there any chance that European political leaders are going to go for something like that?
I actually think I'm quite impressed that we slag it off all the time, that the European Commission has come out with some proposals that actually do try and move the debate forward. Now, here in Britain we're saying, nothing to do with us, and yet what is so dramatically clear about this particular crisis, this is a European crisis. It's not a particularly national crisis. This is a pan-European question. Now, the Commission's been quite clever in actually presenting the burden sharing not as mandatory quotas, but as ones that people will engage into. And I wonder, and I think I come back to what Morris was saying about, we do need, if you like, popular and public pressure to say, we are prepared to do more. We don't accept this hostility. When you take somebody who's a very clever politician, Nigel Farage, who actually made the distinction in the election campaign, but I don't want European migrants, but we will take the desperate refugees, brackets, if they're Christian. But actually he did realise that in the public mind that distinction is clear, I think.
Patrick?
I just wanted to add a quick point, which is, I think the genesis of the question was like, isn't this a pie in the sky idea? Well, I think it's even more pie in the sky to assume there's any other solution. Look at the numbers that came across the sea last year. It was about 210,000. This year, at current rates, even before the smuggling season really gets going properly, the rates are far higher. It might even be 250,000 across the sea this year. So let's say over 5 years that pattern continues. You've already got 1 million people who are crossing the sea in what we call illegal ways. So why not just bite the bullet and be realistic about it and say, well, why don't we offer a safer way for people to come here if they're going to come here anyway?
I just want to go back to the...
Theresa May will take you in any time.
I just want to go back to the Australia question. And Morris, this is a question for you, because the solution in Australia may be barbaric, it may be internationally illegal, But politically, it's been a success. Tony Abbott was elected by saying, I will stop the boats.
Yes.
And if you talk to Australians, they even use that language. Many who would even describe themselves as liberals saying, well, the boats have stopped and that's a good thing. That surely is a challenge, isn't it, for those who think that what they're doing is terrible?
The line is, we've stopped the boats, deaths at sea. And it's quite a compelling argument when you come to a government like ours. But they've done it doing two things. One is that, as the woman who asked the question pointed out, they've got offshore processing agreements, and they move people off to the dreadful camps where the incidents of self-harm are off the scale, appalling places. Journalists not allowed anywhere near them, no public access to them at all. And the other thing is, they actually read from whence they've came. And we haven't got regional resettlement facilities around the Mediterranean, and no prospect of developing them. And B, you just wouldn't get away with it, would you? You'd be in court before you knew it if you tried it on the fundamental of not sending people back to harm. Specifically, the question you asked of the Australian government they've been over here, they've been talking to government officials. I did a radio interview with a senator who was channeling Tony Abbott, and he was in London at the time. So yes, they are, but I hope they've been given a polite reception and told to go on their merry way.
You hope. We've got time for one final round of questions, and I'm going to go as far back as I can. So first of all, the woman there with her hand in the air, the pen, and then here and here.
Hi, my name is Ruth Mandel, and I have assuming, I'd like responses from the panel, assuming that Islamophobic reductionism is indeed too simplistic an explanation, how would you understand the current historical moment when EU countries are able to watch thousands drown at sea on their borders? It's not the first time in history that immigrants have been labeled as cockroaches and norovirus, as Katie Hopkins recently did in The Sun. So what is it about the current moment that allows this to happen that's different, that's fundamentally different? And then just a footnote to Quentin Peele about Germany. It's very encouraging that the Chancellor indeed condemns publicly Pegida, but I would argue that there still is not sufficient social space for integrating migrants when 4 generations of Turks born in Germany still cannot be called German, even if they're German citizens. They're always Germans with migrant background or the like.
Okay, the gentleman here with the white shirt.
Hi, I just had a little point to share and then a question, if I may. I work in the maritime security industry, and I just wanted to share that the commercial shipping have actually really pulled their weight in the whole crisis at the moment, and it is fan to see that they pull back to Triton and say that we don't have to launch these search and rescue operations, when in fact we do. It's completely underlined in UN conventions, in UNCLOS, the law of the sea, and in SOLAS, safety of life at sea, and in search and rescue specific conventions as well. And it's the fact that smugglers know these conventions exist, and they know that commercial shipping will pull their weight as well. And in order to elicit responses, it should be known, and I've not seen it in the press much at all, that smugglers will actually throw out children or pregnant women from these boats and allow them to drown, essentially, in order to elicit responses from these merchant vessels. So I think that's an important note to make, that we can't just, even if we wanted to, pull back from these responsibilities that we're trying to do at the moment, that pull factor nonsense. But the point I actually wanted to make was about EU intervention, and I don't know who this is best to ask. I don't want to indulge in conspiracy theories, but is this idea of military intervention, as far as I understand it, that will be the first EU military intervention? And is there a possibility that the idea of some sort of action in Libya is the idea of the EU giving itself a test run for military action in the future, which no doubt it has multiple challenges, Russia and the like? Is this the EU potentially kind of learning to walk?
And the final question, there was a woman just behind you, 2 rows back.
Hi, I'm Lizzie, I'm a reporter. The debate in Europe at the moment is understandably focused on the Mediterranean, but I was looking today at the Aegean, where the numbers are rocketing kind of in the way we saw in the Mediterranean this time last year. 30,000 people from Turkey to Greece in the first 4 months, and I think 1,500 people landing in Kos just this week. So considering how long the world took to wake up to the crossings in the Mediterranean, is the next crisis going to be the Aegean if the EU does actually do something about the Med?
Okay. We'll start with Patrick on the Aegean. I mean, this does look to me like a room full of Daily Mail readers, so I'm sure you all saw it today. There was a wonderful Daily Mail piece about some plucky British holidaymakers in Kos, whose holiday was ruined I say, by the sight of people arriving on the shore. Patrick, the Aegean.
Well, I mean, first of all, maybe there's a sort of confusion about definition and stuff. I think sometimes, certainly when I talk about the Mediterranean crisis, I'm talking also about the Aegean as well. Like the numbers I mentioned earlier, that included the Aegean. But certainly, I mean, like, yeah, you're exactly right. We've seen this like massive spike of people not just crossing from Libya, but now from Greece to the Greek islands. And as I was saying earlier, it's almost as many as it has been in the last few months, almost as many as it was in the entirety of last year. So it's something that we should definitely be paying more attention to, as the Daily Mail kindly was this morning. But I think just for me, the takeaway from that is that we can be focusing on Libya, and we can be focusing on the idea that, you know, if we eradicate all the smuggling networks along that coast, that would solve the problem. Well, no, actually, there's still hundreds of thousands of maybe over 1 million Syrians in Turkey who are looking at the war in Syria and seeing that it's got no conclusion in sight, and even if it did, it might be a country that they wouldn't want to return to. They're starting to cross into Greece. The second factor in that is the big commercial ships that were being used last year by Syrians to go to Italy. The Turks have clamped down on that finally. So yeah, that's going to continue and continue and continue. And just for me, it just reiterates the fact that this is a huge wave of migration that isn't going to end anytime soon. And the sooner we're more realistic about the fact it's going to carry on.
Maurice, I want to ask you about the issue of language and the way that migrants are being described. Is that to do with their religion, or is this just whenever newcomers arrive that just aren't a bit like us, we find ways to describe them?
Yeah, well, my dad told me that he was around when the signs were up saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, and don't change in that regard. For communities under pressure that feel that they're being asked to go beyond what is realistic, but in terms of what the communities can stand up to. But I don't think scapegoating and criminalisation ultimately works. I think people fight back. I think people take what they hear from the media, and it's a wall of negativity, but they process that. I live in inner London. I live in Hackney. We seem to get along okay in a very, very cosmopolitan and mixed place, because we balance what we get through, what we're told and the way the news is framed with our daily experience, and we make judgments. And that's why I say lies in community level activity. Can I just say something about the shipping question? I think merchant shipping in the Mediterranean have played there's an untold story there of really good work. I saw a film made by the Norwegian Ship Owners Association, very proud of the search and rescue work they do, and they equip all their boats to anticipate that they're going to be called to a search and rescue mission. They work with the Norwegian Refugee Council to train up their staff so that their staff can get a sense of the kind of traumatic experiences the people that they'll be picking out of the sea are likely to have, and how do you manage that, and how do you handle that? And sadly, when I've suggested it to the Home Office, they've laughed that we would get the same rights of access.
I want to end briefly with comments from everyone, and despite what we've been talking about, I wonder whether we can end on a hopeful note. Catherine, is there anything which makes you hopeful about where this debate is going in the next 12 months?
Yeah, an awful lot of the grassroots support for accommodating refugees, and the acceptance that people fleeing the war in Syria are refugees. I mean, I think those are really important moves. I suppose the other thing has been witnessing just a really widespread moment where people can tell that this is not right. I mean, and I think we're at one of those junctures where we can reaffirm humanitarian principles and create institutions that are fit for purpose. But it does feel like one of those moments where an awful lot is to play for. And I think if people really engage, I guess if we can try to get across a very simple message saying military means to suppress mobility, and then think creatively about accommodating refugees and having institutions that are fit for purpose. I see a lot. I see that there's actually a huge groundswell of support and sympathy, as well as fear and concern.
Maurice Wren, is that groundswell of support only in rooms like this, or is it elsewhere?
No, as I say, it's happening across the country. People are staying in their local community. They want to affect change in their local community. They don't think that their ambition doesn't rise to thinking they're going to change government policy overnight. But they know they can make some changes locally, and they're seeing the examples of other parts of the country where that is happening, and where local people, I'll give you an example. I spoke to somebody yesterday who contacted me 6 months ago from Edinburgh, said a group of churches, we're thinking of opening our homes. How would we get Syrian refugees to be allocated to our homes? I said, you don't need to. Talk to the Home Office and talk to the local authority and get them to talk to the Home Office. Now, Edinburgh is going to be taking a small number, but a number, they've got the principle adapted. They're part of the Syrian resettlement scheme. Change can happen at a local level if good people come together and put their mind to it. Just one thing about the German question that we were asked about, the integration question. The important thing with refugees is safety. And what the Germans are doing is opening their doors and giving people safety. And I don't think at this stage we need to go beyond that. I think there are broader questions about integration in German society, but you look at the German football team, it's now got an awful lot of people of Turkish origin in it. So something's happening in the country. I think there's grounds for guarded optimism. I think what the European Commission have come up with is a positive step forward. I don't think it's got all the answers, but it's opened up the debate. My conspiracy theory is a different one from yours. I think the military thing is in there in order to make the other stuff palatable. I don't think they're serious about large-scale military operation, and certainly the information we're seeing from the way it's being discussed by militaries in Europe, they don't know what they're being asked to do, and they obviously feel uncomfortable about it.
Quentin Peel, when you look at the political situation in Europe, are you optimistic that that political situation will change, that the anti-immigration rhetoric that we've seen in many parts of Europe will abate over the next few years?
No, I'm not. I think that the situation is pretty grim, and I think that the main political establishment is on the defensive and in the retreat in face of a populist trend, and that's very worrying. What I want to finish with, and Ruth, I promise I'll also come back at perhaps together your question about the Turkish community in Germany, but I want to finish with the responsibility of the media, because I think this is huge, and I think what Patrick has told us today is absolutely nothing from a media point of view that can beat getting out there and reporting precisely what is happening, who's there, who are the people on the ground, and so on. That is a wonderful message, which I fear most of our media organisations aren't doing enough about to find the situation on the ground. Listening to Theresa May the other day, getting away with the statement that refugees from Somalia and Eritrea were actually economic migrants, and not being challenged, even on the Today programme, that epitome of challenging, is shocking. We've got to have better information, good information, and we got to publish that information, and we got to send lots of reporters like Patrick right out to the front line.
Patrick, let's go back to the beginning and the people that you've been meeting and talking to. They've made a perilous journey just to get as far as where you're meeting them in Libya and elsewhere. What are their hopes for when they arrive in Europe?
When logistical or just
their
general?
hopes, their dreams.
Well,
what is it they want their lives to be like?
Okay, I mean, maybe a good place to end on is the subject of a story that is coming out next week that I've written. It's a whole narrative about my friend Hashim, who left his home 3 years ago in near Damascus. He was tortured. His home was demolished. He took his children to Egypt, and Egypt's really not a hospitable place for Syrians at the moment. And to get on the boat, they were arrested as they did so. Fortunately, you might say that boat, well, they didn't get on that boat because it sank, and 500 people died. That was last September. He tried again a few weeks ago, and before he went, I asked him, "Why are you going again? Like you almost died the first time. You got arrested doing so. Why are you doing it?" And he said, "Because if I die, it's just me who dies. But if I succeed, every single one of my 3 children will have a future. They can be an engineer, they can be a doctor, they can be an artist, they can be a musician." And I was reading what he told me today, just before I left the office. That's why people are crossing the sea, because they want to have a stable future, either in their home country or in their country of transit.
We'll leave it there. I need to thank the Frontline Club and Millicent for hosting us today. Also the team from Monocle 24 at the back. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all for coming today. There will be drinks served up here, downstairs. They'll let us into the bar, that's nice. There'll be drinks downstairs. We put some money behind the bar. Please do stick around. Many of the panellists will be sticking around as well. And finally, please thank panellists today: Patrick Kingsley, Quentin Peel, Maurice Wren, and Catherine Costello.